Mesdames et messieurs, je vous souhaite la bienvenue au nom de la Fondation de Jean Monnet pour l'Europe. Et je voudrais, en commençant, remercier la direction de l'Université de Lausanne pour le verre de bienvenue et au service de l'université pour leur soutien à l'organisation de cet événement de ce jour. Comme d'habitude, ils sont des très bons partenaires et bien appréciés de notre part. This afternoon, our guest will address you in English. So if you need to have some translation, we have headsets available. Il faut prévenir tout le monde en avant si on a besoin d'une traduction anglais-français. Notre sujet aujourd'hui, c'est l'Europe sociale. C'est un sujet politiquement sensible, un sujet très vaste, et nous disposons du temps, je pense, pour des très bons échanges de vous et de commentaires et de questions. Évidemment, la politique quotidienne et surtout la montée du populisme touche et donne des contraintes, en effet, pour la réalisation et l'évolution de chaque politique, y inclut les normes autour de la politique sociale. Nous avons les défis climatiques, la révolution industrielle, donc la digitalisation, l'intelligence artificielle. Nous avons les données démographiques en Europe qui pèsent un peu sur tout le monde. Nous avons les effets du Brexit. Nous avons les défis pour le multilatéralisme, qui est une base que l'Europe a bien exploitée et dont nous avons besoin. Nous avons la nécessité de penser d'un modèle économique vraiment durable. Il y a un grand débat autour de la qualité du travail. Il y a des ouvriers bien récompensés avec du travail de qualité, mais il y a aussi beaucoup d'emplois très précaires. Nous avons cette idée d'une transition avec justice pour le changement climatique, bien sûr, mais il y a pas mal d'autres changements qui pèsent sur nos systèmes économiques. Et si on a tout cela, il y a aussi le défi pour tous les Européens, à l'intérieur ou à l'extérieur de l'Union européenne, comment garder une position clé dans le monde actuel d'aujourd'hui. On a eu, même il y a une décennie, parmi les plus grandes sociétés du monde, beaucoup de sociétés européennes. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas le cas. On se trouve parmi les premiers 20, mais pas les premiers 10. Et maintenant que notre statut diminue avec le passage du temps, donc il y a vraiment des défis d'innovation, de compétitivité, et tout cela aussi est un autre aspect de l'Europe sociale. Donc, pour faire l'introduction à notre conférencier de cet après-midi, M. Per Hilmarsson, il est élu secrétaire général adjoint de la Confédération européenne des syndicats lors du congrès de Vienne en mai de l'année dernière. Au sein de la CES, Per s'occupe de toute une série de questions sur l'emploi, la mobilité équitable et le détachement des travailleurs, la politique régionale, la cohésion économique et sociale, la santé et la sécurité au travail, le commerce international et les actions visant à garantir un protocole de progrès social. Pierre a travaillé dans le domaine des affaires européennes, principalement sur les questions liées aux syndicats, et a travaillé pour les confédérations syndicales suédoises, le Parti socialiste européen, la Commission européenne et le Parlement européen. Et malheureusement, je dois vous dire que Mme Thérèse de Liedekerke, directrice générale adjointe de Business Europe, a dû annuler sa participation en dernière minute. Et donc, bon, c'est la vie, donc il faut l'accepter et continuer. Et donc, j'aimerais bien maintenant inviter Père Hilmersson à venir à la chaire pour délivrer sa conférence. Et puis, on peut poser nos questions, faire nos commentaires et approfondir notre appréciation du sujet. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, President Cox, and thank you very much for the invitation and the hospitality shown by you and the team at Fondation Jean Monnet. It's a great pleasure to be here in the beautiful city of Lausanne in this very nice university. As you heard, I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, the E2C, representing 45 million workers in 90 trade union confederations in 38 countries, including Switzerland. I've been invited here to speak about social Europe. And what better to begin with than a quote from Jean Monnet, that the countries of Europe are too small to guarantee their peoples the necessary prosperity and social development. The European states must constitute themselves into a federation. This insight, this understanding, was expressed almost 75 years ago, and it's of course still valid. The European Union is essentially about values. EU member states believe in democracy, solidarity, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, which includes workers' rights and trade union rights. We also share in Europe common goals, such as gender equality, social protection, inclusiveness, non-discrimination, and universal access to education and healthcare. The EU treaties establishes that the European Union is a social market economy with the goals of full employment and social progress. The importance of the social partners is recognized. That is the European social model. It is about combining economic competitiveness with solidarity and social justice in a way that is mutually reinforcing. But the European social model is not homogeneous. It takes different forms in different regions and countries of Europe. Each country implements the European model in its own way, according to its own history and social traditions. That's the idea with the EU, and as the motto goes, united in diversity. I'm from Sweden, one of the Nordic countries, and the fact is that the Nordic countries the Nordic model sets an example for many other European countries. The Nordic countries have amongst the highest public spending in the EU, but are at the same time amongst the best performing economies in the world. That's because they combine a high level of competitiveness with a high level of social security and environmental standards. The labor market is characterized by flexibility and security, both for companies and for workers, with autonomous social partners agreeing through collective agreements on wages and working conditions. The Nordic countries are, in short, shining examples of the European social model. Today, however, the European social model, even the successful Nordic one, is facing serious challenges. Perhaps the most serious challenge is populism and xenophobia. In May last year, the elections to the European Parliament took place. These elections marked a crossroads One way leading to more social Europe, another towards the decline of European cooperation as we know it. All over Europe we see the rise of far rights, nationalist and populist parties, questioning basic democratic principles, including trade union and workers' rights. We're quite worried about what's happening in Hungary, in Poland, in my own country, Sweden, with the Sweden Democrats, and with AfD in Germany, and the list goes on. Where these parties are in power, human and democratic rights are put at risk. I'm talking about the freedom of speech, freedom of media and press, the rule of law, the right not to be discriminated. But also, social rights are questioned. First and foremost, the freedom of association, of organizing, and of collective bargaining, which are also foundations of a living democracy, a functioning democracy. We should not underestimate widespread populism, nationalism and xenophobia, and the problems that are behind them. We often see these negative sentiments growing among workers, even among our own members. But we would make a huge mistake if we blame them for this. On the contrary, we have a responsibility to understand the underlying causes. We have to look at the scars left by the economic crisis that started over 10 years ago. And this is the second challenge for social Europe. Even if EU economy is growing again, and there have been positive developments in the European labour markets, social inequalities in and between EU member states are still very high. The gender employment gap is too big, almost 12%, and the employment pay gap is not closing, it's still around 16%. Youth unemployment in European regions range from 4% to 62%. And too many young people find only low-wage, temporary and non-standard jobs. Job growth in general is fueled by poor quality jobs and precarious forms of work, which prohibit access to social protection and pensions entitlements. Many people's wages are worth less than a decade ago, and work is no longer a guarantee of escaping poverty. 1 in 10 workers is at risk of poverty. So cuts in public services, the growth of precarious jobs, widening inequalities, unregulated globalization are among the failures that have left people disillusioned with mainstream politicians and led to a rise in populist, anti-European, nationalist and far-right forces. Another challenge is, of course, climate change and environmental degradation. We need to adapt our economy, our industry, how we travel and work in order to give future generations a fighting chance. The new European Commission has proposed a European Green Deal with the ambition for Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. But the transition that is needed creates quite a lot of worries among many workers. Worries about their jobs, social security, and that they won't have the right skills for the new jobs emerging in the green economy. The worries and concerns are strengthened by the challenges of digitalization, automatization, and also a more aging population. Some studies have suggested that half of today's work activities could be automated by 2055. And today there are 3 workers for 1 pensioner. In 2050, there will be 2 workers for each pensioner. So workers see how climate change, digitalization, and demographic change can impact their jobs and their lives, while often policymakers are failing to address these challenges properly. A lack of social Europe tends to erode people's trust in the future, so we need to have a more social Europe. We have to give people their future back, a future for workers of today and their children, a future where everyone can have a decent job, a living wage, access to equal rights and protection, to quality housing, healthcare, education and training. This is, again, the European social model, or it's supposed to be. At the ETUC Congress last year, we put forward proposals on how to strengthen social Europe and put forward a vision how we together can work for a better and prosperous future that benefits all, not the few. I'm just going to mention a few steps to achieve this vision, according to the ETUC. We can move from austerity to a more sustainable economic model by making EU economic governance more social and more environmentally respectful, by boosting public and private investments to create more quality jobs. And here the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights is key. It's about complementing the economic agenda with a social agenda, realizing that both are needed in order to promote sustainable and inclusive growth. We can establish frameworks to manage a just transition towards a carbon neutral and digital economy, where nobody is left behind. This is not only about setting up a just transition fund, which the European Commission recently proposed, but particularly about creating new and better jobs to offer to those who are affected by these changes and to provide them with better skills to be able to adapt. And this is very important. When old jobs disappear and new ones are created, EU member states need well-functioning transition support systems, both for upskilling and reskilling of the workforce. This is not least important in the limelight of digitalization and the fourth industrial revolution. According to the Commission, half of the current EU workforce will need to update their skills in the next 5 years. But on average, only 1 adult in 10 take part in training, and only 1 in 25 low-skilled workers benefit from lifelong learning. The EU should therefore ensure a right to lifelong learning. That's the first principle, actually, of the social pillar, and create a fund for co-financing the development of structures for transition support systems at national level. It's also about social partners being at the forefront of the process through social dialogue and collective bargaining. We can shape the global economy, in particular through a European trade agenda, which makes sure that the respect of workers' rights and the environment are compulsory in all international trade agreements, and through a European framework on due diligence and responsible business conduct, which obliges multinational companies and their supply chains to stop implementing an anti-trade union and cheap labor agenda within and outside Europe. We can stop the downward spiral on wages we have faced over the last years, which has created huge inequalities and injustice, while not improving our economies. We can start a process for pay rise and for closing the wage gap between East and West, North and South. We can do it through better minimum wage systems where they exist, but more importantly by collective agreements and reinforcing the capacity of social partners to deliver strong collective bargaining everywhere. We can make labour markets more fair by ensuring equal rights and social protection, including the right to collective bargaining and decent wages, to all categories of workers, young and old, women and men, locals and migrants, traditional workers, but also non-standard and platform workers, freelancers and self-employed. We can make jobs more safe and workplaces more healthy. Each year there are 4,000 fatal accidents at work in the EU. 120,000 people die of work-related cancer, and over a quarter of workers in Europe experience excessive work-related stress. We therefore need a new and ambitious EU strategy on occupational safety and health, including a zero vision on work-related cancer and fatal accidents at work, and an EU directive to end stress at the workplace. And we can make sure that the reform of the European legal framework on mobility can be completed, so that we can guarantee full equal treatment to posted and mobile workers inside the EU and stop social dumping. The newly created European Labour Authority will be an important tool in this respect. But in order to truly achieve equal treatment and fair mobility, we need to change the EU treaties and include a social protocol which can establish a balance between economic freedoms on the internal market and fundamental trade union rights, and stipulating that if there is a conflict between the two, then social rights should prevail. And I'm happy to hear that Commission President von der Leyen has announced a conference on the future of Europe, which will be launched on May 9th this year and will run for 2 years, which could actually lead to treaty changes. So the European Trade Union movement will be very active in this and push for the proposal for a social protocol. And regarding the point, this point on mobility and posted workers, the ETUC is aware of the pressure from the EU on Switzerland during the negotiations on a new framework agreement to dismantle the so-called accompanying measures or flanking measures, which were introduced to protect posted workers and Swiss workers and to fight against social dumping, abuses and undercutting of wages. We as ETUC takes the view that under no circumstances should any EU framework, trade or partnership negotiation lead to the lowering of social standards or salaries in the partner country. In this regard, the European Trade Union movement demands that the Swiss flanking measures are maintained. The European Union should always act to safeguard and improve workers' rights, not undermine them. The introduction of free movement of people, combined with effective accompanying measures, has been a major step forward to ensure both fair competition and equal treatment for all workers in Switzerland. Compared with the era of the old quota systems, foreign employees working in Switzerland are now less exposed to abuses and unfair behavior by employers. Workers are now better protected against bad working conditions, poverty, wages and exploitation. The principle that Swiss wages are paid in Switzerland applies in practice, and that's very good. The European Trade Union movement strongly supports the position of the Swiss trade unions and calls on the European Commission, to ensure respect for the safeguards and requirements included in the current version of the accompanying measures. A weakening of these measures cannot be accepted. Actually, the fight to maintain the Swiss accompanying measures is part of a European struggle to strengthen workers' rights and working conditions and to ensure the correct enforcement and application of labor and social rights. It's about defending our rights and wages instead of borders. Trade unions in the European Union and in Switzerland stand together in this essential fight to ensure a more fair and social Europe. Allow me to also underline the importance of the bilateral relations between Switzerland and the EU. They must be preserved because it creates jobs for our members, both in the EU and in Switzerland. On the 17th of May, Switzerland will have a referendum on the future of these relations. If passed, it would not only lead to the termination of the agreement on freedom of movement and of course the abolition of the accompanying measures, it would also mean the end of all bilateral agreements between Switzerland and the EU. That would be catastrophic, both for the EU and for Switzerland and for workers. This, of course, reminds me of Brexit. As you know, the transition period started Saturday, and both sides have now presented their first draft positions. I just briefly wanted to say that the ETUC believes that in the future deal between the EU and the UK, existing workers' rights must be protected and there should be a level playing field so that the UK upholds EU employment and social standards. To protect the existing legislation, a non-regression clause will be necessary. Preventing a race to the bottom is fundamental to avoid undercutting of standards and rights for workers across EU27. A level playing field would also ensure that British workers' rights do not fall behind those in the rest of Europe. The future EU-UK relationship should maintain jobs and living standards for workers across Europe by ensuring that access for the UK to the single market is only possible on condition of continuing adherence to the four freedoms: free movement of goods, services, capital and persons. To conclude, there are many challenges for Europe and especially for social Europe, but I'm an optimist. Things are changing because leading politicians and even some employers have started to understand that without better working conditions and more social fairness, there will be no sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Without a social Europe, there is a risk of citizens turning their backs on Europe, on cross-border cooperation. Delivering on all the concrete actions I've mentioned in my speech means making social Europe real. It's about fair social and working conditions, strong social dialogue and trade union rights, as well as effective transition support systems. They are key factors to increased equality, social progress, competitiveness, sustainable growth, and employment. In the beginning of my speech, I was cautioning about the rise of far-right and populist parties. Luckily, the result of the European Parliament elections was not as bad as we had feared. But the two biggest political groups, the Conservatives and Social Democrats, lost their majority. So the Parliament is more split and multipolar. There are more divisions than before between East and West, North and South, and between those who want more Europe and those who want less. It will probably be more difficult for the Parliament to decide on important issues, and the ETUC will have to work extra hard to make our voice heard in Brussels. But again, I'm an optimist. There are some positive signs. Several of our demands from our Congress and proposals have already been picked up by the new members of the European Parliament and the new European Commission. Now we as the ETUC will work hard to turn them into reality. We are engaged in dialogue and negotiations with the Parliament, the Commission, with national governments and the employers. We're influencing the political agenda and trying to push the various initiatives in the right direction. In this way, we're trying to contribute to making Europe more social. And to go back to the meaning of Jean Monnet's words, we need to cooperate more, not less, to have social progress. Thank you.
Per, thank you very much. I think you've opened up a vast canvas, and eventually we have the opportunity to turn to you for comment and contributions or questions. Could I begin with one or two of the general themes that you have raised? One of them is the rise of populism and all of the issues around classic freedoms. And you mentioned freedom of association as one of those areas. In some respects, when we stand back from it, although country by country there are different origins, the scars of deep austerity have been in part the basis on which a lot of populism has been able to grow. And if one looks at some of the shocking statistics for unemployment or working poor in Greece or Italy, in a kind of way the population had tried the classic centre right and gave up on it. They tried the classic centre left and gave up on it. They tried technocratic government and they gave up on it. And then they thought, what the hell, maybe these other guys are not so good, but they haven't screwed things up yet, so why don't we try them? And there's a certain sense where this has been repeating itself in so many places. Again, if I look at Brexit, you had two pillars in the argument. One, broadly economism, saying don't go there, it's bad for the economy, it will ruin jobs and growth and prosperity. And the other one focusing on issues of identity and culture, and the cultural identity pillar won. So one of the things we can see, problematic and challenging as it may be, that in many places, populism, to quote a man I don't like quoting, Mr. Farage, I saw recently on British television, saying populism is becoming very popular. So just in that context, since you raised the issue, there's a degree of embeddedness in what we're calling populism, which indeed is proving popular with various electorates in various places. And it means some way, even if it didn't have the great win that they anticipated in the European Parliament election, that it's becoming an increasingly embedded reality of European political culture. Whether desirable or not, I park because that is the part of the debate. So how do you evaluate that? You raise the issue as threatening the fabric of social Europe. Does it not mean that that threat risks in this context to be even greater than it may have been some years ago?
Yeah, this is a fundamental issue and question, and I don't have obviously the answer really. It's just we have to realize, for us trade unions, we're realizing that where we are weak, in those countries where we're weak, the populism are growing more. So we are part of the solution, we believe. In fact, the reason why people are disillusioned and feeling left behind is because policies have failed and national parties have failed. And in those countries where trade unions are strong, there is less income inequality, social inequalities. There is a stronger democratic foundation, but they're not safe. They're not guaranteed from it. I mentioned in my speech in Sweden, where I would say that we are strong, but we also have a very strong far-right party in terms of called Sweden Democrats. I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm Swedish, and we're optimists. I think there was 10 years of dark years during Barroso. It was not Barroso's fault, but it was the economic crisis, and we saw that on the political agenda, on the EU political agenda, our issues, social issues, health and safety, social rights, they were not on the agenda because it was seen as we don't have time now. Now we have to implement austerity measures, and I think they have realized now. We've seen it during Jean-Claude Juncker's era mandates, the past mandates. They have realized that we can't do one-sided austerity measures only. Economic policies cannot only be about budget control and being rigid or frugal. It is about also social fairness, that it needs to go hand in hand. And therefore, the development of the pillar of social rights and all other legislation during the Jean-Claude Juncker era. So I hope we're on the right path again. There is a understanding that we can't just let social inequalities grow and the top richest make more profits. It's not sustainable, basically.
And tell me, social progress requires some underlying level of economic success. And we have seen in the Eurozone crisis and in its social and economic and political consequences, part of the design failure of the system. When we look at what tools are missing to avoid repeating that problem should the crisis arise again, what are the tools of economic policy that the trade union movement focuses on as needing development in order to strengthen the underlying economic capacity for an affordable and sustainable social model?
One action we would like to see is a revision of the Stability and Growth Pact to make it less rigid, to allow more social spending, basically, of member states, more productive, more strategic investments that delivers quality jobs. Another is regulation of the financial markets, of course, and this idea that now has been floated by the new European Commission, a European unemployment benefits reinsurance scheme for the Eurozone could be a way forward as well. That in times of crisis, when member states can't really, and there will be high unemployment, and member states can't pay out enough money at the right time, then the EU can support with some kind of reinsurance scheme. Those 3 points, I would say, are quite important.
And do you think, because you'd mentioned this, that you look forward to this new dialogue beginning on the 9th of May, do you think some of these things, in order to accomplish what you have in mind, actually would require changes to the European treaties? Or is it below the treaty level that it requires changes to European policy making?
Well, I think there are some measures needed for the Eurozone countries that would need treaty changes. For instance, a a specific Eurozone budget, specific Eurozone stability mechanism, but also the social protocol, as I mentioned in my speech, would be one of our priority demands.
Let me ask you about another point you made, which is of, I think, a general character and worth trying to develop briefly, about the idea of Europe trying to shape the global economy through its EU trade agenda. When we look at Brexit and at least the opening positioning of who says what, when we look at the America First logic of Mr. Trump, and when we look at the extraordinary and self-interested growth of China, are the conditions there to be able to do what you say is desirable? Of course, the European Union would like to do this, but does it risk, in the actual multilateral circumstances that prevail, to be a bit like a European tail seeking to wag a global dog?
Yeah, looking at the positions presented Monday, it looks like it's going to be very difficult negotiations. The EU is really pushing for a level playing field. We even have an acronym for it now, LPF. While Boris Johnson is quite clear that he's not interested at all in keeping, at least not in the future, keeping the same progress as EU will have. So for us, it's very important, for instance, that when the EU progress in terms of labor standards and social rights, the UK needs to follow. We call it dynamic alignment. But I think Boris Johnson is totally against that, because that would also mean that the European Court of Justice would have a say in the end. Let's see. We'll meet with the EGC. Will meet with Mr. Barnier, the lead negotiator, and I think his position is also very clear that you can have zero quotas, zero tariffs means zero dumping. So we need a level playing field. And I think also a future agreement, if it's a mixed agreement, meaning that EU national parliaments will have a say in the ratification, if such an agreement doesn't include level playing field, there will be a no somewhere. If that will be in Belgium or in Wallonia, or I don't know, but I think this is key.
So without prejudging, because we're just at the beginning, but there is at least a grounded fear that the Brexit at the end of this year could indeed be the hard Brexit that people had speculated on for the past 3 years.
Yeah, that's
a distinct possibility.
Yeah, it is.
Let me ask you then about another theme you raised, which touches across automation, digitalization, climate change, the concept of the just transition, and that nobody should be left behind. I think to do with what I might call the ethical principle in that, it is in principle unarguable. But to do with the dynamics of that, it looks like mission impossible. The rate and pace of change, the rate and pace of this new automation revolution, the extent of the demographic effects on social security systems and their sustainability. You mentioned yourself about the numbers of workers to pensioners. The need to make a radical climate transition. These are not all happening in sequence. They're all happening at the same time. So it's an awfully dynamic environment in which it appears that everybody keeps up to some level all the time, not because it's not desirable, but because of the complexity. It's just actually impossible, that it's a pipe dream.
Yeah. How to face that challenge?
Well, it seems to me, with so many moving parts, while the concept of just transition I understand in all of the contexts. For example, if I look at artificial intelligence as a growing phenomenon in different sectors, yet to fully impact, it's not a once-for-all change. It's a constant change at a growing rate of change. And so its dynamics are radically different to some of the industrial changes we've seen in the past, precisely because of its dynamism and acceleration. If I look to the demographics, the principle of sustainable social security systems is very rough politics. As Mr. Juncker said about the Euro crisis, we know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of people scratching their heads in practical policy making about squaring these circles.
But it needs to be done. It needs to be addressed, and the EU can do as much. I mean, these issues are actually they're national issues, but there is a European dimension, and the EU can help, can promote and support, and that's why we have welcomed this new European Green Deal with European Sustainable Investment Plan from the Commission, delivering, I think it's 1,000 billion euros over 10 years in investments. They will review state aid rules, tax regulation, and in part of this will be a just transition mechanism, which will help member states with regions with carbon-intensive sectors or industries that needs to change, that needs to actually be abolished in the end, like coal mines and stuff. So that's the big role that the EU can play. But I mentioned skills in my speech, and I think we need a skill revolution, basically, because the workforce needs to be more adaptable and be able to take the new jobs emerging in the green economy. I know I saw a number from the Commission that the AI industry will create 60 million jobs in the coming few years, but there needs to be skills. There needs to be workers that can take those jobs. So right now there is a gap, I think, a skills gap, and therefore we need extreme or heavy, big investments in skills. And in Sweden, again, as I know this country best, we have not only national support systems, but we also have the social partners involved in this, with collective agreements to ensure lifelong learning. It's not only about taking care of workers when they've been laid off, it's to constantly keeping them updated and skilled in order to take the new jobs or new assignments at work when workplaces are changing. So I would say upskilling, reskilling the workforce is the answer to these challenges of digitalization, automation.
Let me ask you the slightly related question, and it's to do with the perspective for future employment. So skills is clearly a pillar and a dimension of this, and reskilling. To what extent does the trade union movement share the anxiety that many have about the apparent lack of dynamism of the European economy? I mentioned in my opening remarks how there was a stage not so long ago when, if you looked at the top companies in the world across various sectors, certainly in the top 10 you'd have a lot of European countries. That is less and less the case. And in the technologies of tomorrow, even less and less the case at the moment. So there's something in there to do with the underlying economic capacity to do all these other desirable and good things. Do you worry about that? And what is the trade union's take on this issue of the dynamism or its absence of corporate Europe?
I think our main focus is the need for a new European industrial strategy to support European industries in the global competition. I think the European industries supports over 20% of jobs in Europe. So, of course, that's very important for our members. But that's also an industry involved in digitalization, in automation, in climate change transition. So, as much as the workforce needs to have upskilling and reskilling, also the industry needs to adapt to this. And here we see great potential in common European investments in this, and exchange of best practices and common European enterprises, basically.
Within that, what is the Trade Union Congress view on European competition policy? There's been quite a debate over the past period about what is the appropriate size of a corporation to do with merger and acquisition activity. And in part, the competition policy has raised controversy about whether they've got the right index of measurement. Are we measuring size against global competitors, US and Chinese, Or are we measuring size against the size of the European internal market? And which index should be the size we're measuring against for an effective industrial policy?
Well, we don't really have the answer to that, but we need to look into merger policies we have in the EU in order to, again, for EU to survive in the global competition, and state aid rules. I mean, we see Chinese state-owned companies companies with a lot of aid from the Chinese states are competing on the European markets. So we need to respond to that somehow. We don't have a concrete proposal for it. We just say this needs to be addressed. We need European, I think we call it European champions, champion companies to be able to stand the global competition.
Which tends in the direction of having a different measurement scale to the purely internal market sizing.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's more global.
Right sizing for global rather than right sizing for regional.
Yeah.
Okay. One last thing, because I want to open this up now, but one last thing just in the range of things we've touched on. On the climate transition, and we talked a little bit about Europe and trade and level playing field, the deeper we drive the transition with its corollary costs, so if we were to introduce, for example, significant carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes of more substance, the positive thing is we can improve our contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gases. We can improve our biodiversity. We can improve our urban health. There's a whole package of things that we can improve. And the downside risk is that we add a lot more cost and therefore reduce the competitiveness of European industry. So we've got this idea of the equalizing border tax. Already we can see some of the pushback saying, oh, this is the Europeans wanting to protect themselves, etc. So we don't know how that goes because no one has ever done this yet. Do you have any fears around that and the competitive dynamics of European industry and the sustainability of that competitiveness?
No, but we think that's it's quite an innovative idea and proposal, but I think it's the right one, is to address and to push our trading partners to try to agree on a way that we can trade sustainably. And the EU is nowadays pushing for EU trading partners to sign up to the Paris Agreement before we even can start negotiating with them. So I think, and when it comes to EU free trade agreements, we have this sustainable development chapter in each agreement since 10 years now, I think. And the environmental part is very important, and it's become even more important because of climate change and because of Paris agreements. And for us, for trade unions, the challenge is now, because everyone is talking about the Paris Agreement and that we shouldn't trade with Brazil because of the Amazons. Our challenge is to keep the social standards, social labor standards in those agreements on the same level, that saying that this is important as well as much as environmental issues. It's about sustainable development, basically.
Actually, a very last thing on my part. You mentioned to do with the demographics, in effect, what the analysts call the growing dependency ratio of more people depending on welfare systems and transfers and less at work contributing. This issue of the sustainability of that social fabric, and as you've remarked, it's more at the member state level that the detail happens, is a kind of a universal challenge. An awful lot of governments are struggling with the sustainability of their welfare models. So they're looking at things like adjusting the retirement age, right, or allowing people to work and change contracts that oblige them to quit at 65. It doesn't suit every area of work, I understand, but it also could be open to many. Do you have, because you've talked about frameworks, a general framework proposition that gives some realistic comfort to policymakers at member state level that this issue of sustainability of social security systems is absolutely vital and that a big part of it is also affordability?
Well, we don't have no, I can't really say that we have concrete proposal. I just want to mention one aspect in this, and that's health and safety at work. If we want people to work longer, we need to invest in health and safety at work, because people are, especially in industries and with heavy workloads, they are worn out, and they need to retire much earlier than planned and needed. So we need to that's the most important issue for us. But again, to take the Nordic countries as an example, they will also have a problem with this in the future, of course, with sustainability of finances and in terms of social health care and elderly care. But again, they have managed so far to have the highest social spending, public spending, and still being very competitive. So there is something to learn from those systems.
The so-called flexicurity combination.
Yep.
And you commend that.
Yes.
Very good. Let me turn, if I could, to the audience. Il faut que vous vous présentez en prenant le micro. On peut poser des questions, faire des petits commentaires comme vous voulez. Donc, indiquez, s'il vous plaît, il faut lever les mains et on va vous passer les micros. Donc, le monsieur ici et puis au centre. Bon, allez-y.
Merci, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I am Guillaume Kaiser from Young European Swiss, yes. So my question is regarding federalism, because we are in a federal country. In Switzerland, it's very clear on which level which social issues are treated, like healthcare or social policies or unemployment schemes. But in the European Union, it's not so clear between member states and the European Union who does what. So what is your point of view on what should be on the European level and what should be on the member state level? And should the European level have more a function of ensuring a level playing field between member states and not dictate or edict certain policies that should be adapted exactly that way? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, in general, the EU Treaty says that gives the EU fairly limited powers when it comes to employment issues and social issues. But the EU can, as you probably know, legislate in a quite wide area, especially health and safety. We have like 25 directives there, and working conditions, mobility issues, posting of workers, of course. But the main idea is for this to be minimum standards, so it's called minimum directives, EU directives. And the idea is to have at least a floor of rights and protections for workers all over Europe, so we don't compete on an internal market based on low salaries and bad working conditions, and that the competition should be based on more innovative companies and knowledge. And I think this is a constant discussion also inside the EGC. What was the right level? There was a long discussion when it came to this European Pillar of Social Rights, if that should be binding or not. Should individuals be able to go to the European Court of Justice and say, I have a right to lifelong learning, but Sweden doesn't give us that? That's just an example. So we had a long discussion, and we came to the conclusion this needs to be done case by case. So the EU should have the same the competence it has according to the treaties, but it's mainly up to the member states to deliver on this. And that's important to remember, that the EU member states actually signed up to this pillar of social rights. It's not only the Commission and Parliament and in Brussels, it's the member states. And now the Commission will come out in beginning of next year with an action plan to deliver how to implement this pillar of social rights, because that's the new social strategy of Europe, I would say. We've had many discussions on the future of Europe. So, what should the EU's role be in the social policy field in the future? We don't have an answer yet, because we do have in the European trade union movement some different views. From the Nordic countries, for instance, they are a bit hesitant that the EU should have too much say on these issues, while other organizations from countries with a bad social policy, national policy, they of course want the EU to help and to guarantee their rights and protections.
My own sense, because I think your question is very good, the clarity that you expect to find in the constitutional and policy order in a mature federation is radically more advanced than the yardstick we should apply to the European Union, which is no such thing. There are people who aspire to it, but there's no such thing. And equally, the European Union is not merely an intergovernmental body, but there is a contractual foundation in the treaties. So in a certain sense, Europe is always on a journey to somewhere, but that journey for a long period and for a long period to come will be in a permanent state of in-betweenness, not just intergovernmental and not classically federal. And that state of in-betweenness, of course, creates grey space. Yes, please. Another intervention. Can you introduce yourself, please, and then proceed?
Hello, my name is Luis. I'm the Labour Councillor of the Spanish Embassy here in Switzerland. And first, I would like to thank the Foundation Jean Monnet for this conference and the spokesperson of the trade unions here. I would like to know your views in two different fields. I have two little questions. First one is regarding the referendum that will take place here in Switzerland on May. It's an important one, and I remember in this time of fake news, populism, misinformation, I recall that nobody expected Trump winning the election, nobody expected Brexit. I remember at that time I was working at the ILO. I remember that I felt how far are we from the real people that suffer the crisis, that go to vote. Although I have been searching different surveys about the results of this referendum, I have fear. And I would like to know what are the views of the trade unions, if they are they're pushing, they are trying to mobilize as hard as they can, because although the figures of the referendum are such, in my opinion, positive, the number somehow makes me fear of the result, because the consequences are really, really important. And the second question, it's about the merger of Alstom Siemens that was blocked at the European Union level. I would like to know, again, the views of the trade unions regarding that decision of European Union. Do we need to change European Union competition policies in order to allow European companies to grow and to compete abroad with Chinese enterprises or United States, or there are other possibilities? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, when it comes to the referendum, I expressed some severe concerns in my speech that, of course, we don't want this relation with Switzerland to end. So I'm not sure how the question will be put in the referendum, but I guess I should say we're hoping for a yes, or I mean to keep the relation, to keep the agreement. Basically, not stop free movement of workers, because it's important for our members. It's important for jobs in Switzerland and the EU. I mean, the question you asked about, will we mobilize? I think that's the question for the Swiss unions, of course. I think I won't say more than that. On the Alstom case, well, I also addressed that a bit. I think, as I said, we need to look into, into these policies we have and the restrictions we have because of the global competition, because of how it's done in China and the US probably, including state aid rules. And also when it comes to competition policies, what we would like to have to change is actually, it's also in the treaty, is that the treaty basically stops self-employed workers to unionize. to organize, because they will be regarded as cartel, and then that will be prohibited. So if the treaty will be changed in the future, we will also want to change that to allow workers, which they are, even if they're self-employed, we see them as workers, they should be able to organize.
S'il vous plaît, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Pierre-Yves Maillard, président de l'Union syndicale suisse. Je vais répondre à votre question sur l'engagement syndical, sur la votation sur la résiliation de la libre circulation. Donc effectivement, il faudra répondre non, puisque l'initiative demande la résiliation des accords. Nous allons nous engager dans cette campagne. Nous allons investir des moyens. Nous allons faire un journal de campagne auprès de presque tous les ménages suisses pour affirmer notre opposition à cette rupture, notamment parce que nous savons exactement ce que veulent les nationalistes qui ont lancé ce projet. Juste après un éventuel succès, ils veulent abolir les mesures d'accompagnement que nous avons conquises ces 20 dernières années avec l'accord de libre circulation. Ils l'ont dit très clairement dans leur conférence de presse de lancement du projet. L'un des reproches qu'ils font à la libre circulation, c'est d'avoir permis une régulation du marché du travail en Suisse avec les mesures d'accompagnement. Et ils veulent attaquer ça. Le néolibéralisme de M. Blorer n'est pas très différent de celui qui existe chez certains acteurs au sein de l'Union européenne. Donc c'est la même histoire. Et c'est pour ça qu'on veut se battre contre cette initiative, parce que si jamais ils gagnent, juste après, ils diront il faut regagner de la vitalité économique, il faut regagner de la compétitivité, donc il faut libéraliser le marché du travail, donc il faut libéraliser le service public. Et c'est évidemment un programme que nous ne voulons pas. Donc on se battra avec énergie contre ce texte. Mais vous avez raison d'exprimer vos craintes, parce que ce sera une bataille difficile, malgré les sondages qui sont souvent trompeurs. Et nous disons d'ailleurs que si on veut donner des chances à l'UDC, le principal risque, c'est de mélanger le débat sur l'initiative et le débat sur l'accord cadre. C'est pour ça qu'on fait tout pour séparer les deux débats, pour qu'on ait un débat clair sur l'initiative UDC, et ensuite on pourra essayer de changer ce texte d'accord cadre pour préserver nos mesures d'accompagnement. Au-delà de ça, j'aimerais profiter d'avoir la parole pour remercier la Confédération européenne des syndicats et M. Emerson pour le soutien qu'ils apportent à notre position, qui est évidemment très important depuis des mois.
Je vous remercie pour cette intervention. S'il vous plaît, ici au centre. Voilà. Et puis, madame.
Thank you very much. My name is Philippe Nel. I am a member of the Council of the Fondation Jean Monnet pour l'Europe. I'm also a university lecturer. And my question refers to the following. The world economy now, in particular the Western world, is in its 12th year of growth, of constant growth. However, as was said already tonight, unemployment, youth unemployment extremely high in a number of European countries. Unemployment remains very, very high in the European Union despite 12 years of consecutive growth. So my question for you is the following. To which extent are the Union part of a problem and of the solution? And you may also make a few remarks on France, who under President Mitterrand made some important changes in labor laws. Today in France, manufacturing is 12% of GDP. In Switzerland, it's about 23% of GDP. And we are working very hard in Switzerland to keep manufacturing at a high level. In the US, it's about 11% of GDP. But looking at the Union, looking back at all these years, looking at unemployment remains so high and so sticky, what do you think as a Union, not looking at sustainability and climate change, but as a Union, what do you think you could have done in terms of being part of a solution? Or in which extent, like looking at France, would the unions be also part of a problem? Thank you.
Per, a nice test of your diplomatic skills.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean, that in what way we would have been a part of the problem. I'm not sure I understand the premise of the question, or that I can agree to it. Could you please elaborate in what way trade unions would have been, if you have that view, if they are part of the problem?
I mean, unemployment remains very high, very high. This is a problem. Unemployment is a problem, and all the stakeholders have a role to play in order to bring unemployment down. And therefore, a government may take some measures, like we have been doing here all the time when there have been some difficulties on the labor market. But in particular, we have kept in this country a very flexible labor market in terms of hiring and firing. Give an example, I was in Uruguay a few months ago, and there, as in several Latin American countries, it's hardly impossible to separate yourself from a worker after you have hired that worker. This very simply means that companies will try not to hire additional workers, will try to expand somewhere else, or will try to subcontract some activities. Therefore, depending on the way the unions establish the relationships, this may have quite a strong impact on the incentive then of companies to hire. We have the examples in France. In France, after you have more than 50 workers in your company, it's become so complex and you have so many additional costs that some people left to Silicon Valley, for instance, and made very large companies out there. So this is a little bit the background of the notion of being part of a problem or also part of a solution, because there are solutions, there are great solutions, certainly, but they are not easy to implement, and I've seen that, for instance, in Latin America. Thank you.
Well, I would like to come back to also what I included in my speech, that's, again, the Nordic model with a combination of security and flexibility. I think that is a very good, it's a key ingredient for more jobs, for sustainable employment. And there, the key there is to give social partners their role. So what member states should do, which don't give enough powers to social partners, is to give them that power and the right to collective bargaining. Because the experience of the Nordic countries actually shows that legislation is quite rigid. It's better if you can agree between social partners on working conditions and in a flexible working labor market. But of course, you can't just change legislation without giving enough powers to the trade unions, which is happening in France. I've heard Macron saying that I would like to have the Nordic model, so I'm giving the power giving the powers to the social partners. But the problem is that the trade unions are too weak. They need to have help to be stronger, and otherwise the employers will basically eat them up, and they will have it will be it will go the other way. It will be the American way instead of the European way.
Do you really think the CGT is weak?
In terms
of all the countries and all the unions that strike me as crossing borders with their actions, it's not one of the shrinking violets of European economic policy.
But there are quite low trade union density in France compared to the Nordic countries with 70%, I think we have.
OK. Finalement, nous avons une femme. Donc, s'il vous plaît.
My name is Asmina Walter. I was very interested and a little bit surprised, but not really, by the two numbers you mentioned about future pension funds. Actually, one worker for two pensioners. In the future, it will be one by one. So it is a dramatic change in economic status, but also socially speaking. And of course, I would like for you to mention what are the perspectives of trade unions about this very near future. What do you propose? What are the changes that have to be made? Are going to have a haircut on benefits? And incidentally, what immigration will play in this context?
Thank you. I was trying to find that number. Yes, indeed, it's actually that number of 3 workers for each pensioner, and if nothing so today, and if nothing changes by 2050, there will be 2 workers for each pensioner. It's from a European Commission document, and this is the reality we're faced with, or the challenge, and there is. Again, on skills and education, because here there is actually a great potential in the so-called silver economy, I think it's called. This will create a lot of jobs, actually.
I could apply for membership.
Yes, well, me as well. And immigration will be key as well, because this number actually shows that we won't have enough workers in the future to take care of the elderly, but it's also a matter of, in general, the population growth and the jobs being offered in Europe. There are more jobs in the future, probably, than workers, so we need immigration as well, for sure, to take care of to continue our societies to grow and for social Europe to be strong in the future.
Okay.
Thank you. I have maybe somewhat academic questions, but nevertheless, I'd be interested in your views. I wonder whether the costs of education in the context of free movement has been or is being discussed or can be considered as an element of dumping. Look, from the point of view of Eastern European countries, for instance, they invest in education of their elite who end up moving to Western countries, make good money. So it's lost. Is this fair? Is this an issue that is being discussed as a form of dumping that might be addressed by measures of compensation for costs induced on the one hand by one country, whilst the benefit of education is being carried over to another country through the free movement of persons?
I think it's not called dumping, but it's called brain drain, I think, more. And this is an issue raised by many Eastern European or former Eastern European countries. They do invest in these citizens who then just move to the West. And we see the problem is the wage gap. There's not high enough wages in these countries. So we have launched a campaign for a pay rise all over Europe, especially in these countries. The EU doesn't have that much to say on this, but Ursula von der Leyen has launched an initiative. She's calling it Fair Minimum Wages. And that's to ensure that, especially in these countries, the minimum wages where they are set by law, that they are high enough. So let's see how the concrete proposal will look like. But we're looking at, it should be at least be 60% of the median national wage. And I think like 17 member states who have statutory minimum wages are below this number, and those are countries that are faced with brain drain. And I'm not talking about only high-skilled people; it's also low-skilled that goes to other countries to do the jobs because the wages are higher. So this is a real issue and something to be addressed, and is being addressed by this Commission.
Let me ask you if I could. It's unfortunate today that the counterparts are not here from Business Europe. And so this is probably, you're not the ideal person to ask, but I think I should ask you. If someone was sat here from Business Europe and we'd been listening to their point of view, from your perception, what are the key differences between what you are asking of politicians and the European institutions and what they are asking of those same institutions? You must know each other so well that, that these things are well known and rehearsed.
I'm not used to be alone. I'm just to have the employer. That's and it makes it easier as well. I think we share the same goals when it comes to social Europe, and maybe they have some other priorities, of course, but the main difference is what the EU should do. I mean, what are the tools to be used to achieve those goals? And the main difference is, our main controversy is legislation at the EU level. I think the employers have difficulties with legislation in general. They don't want it at any level. If there is legislation, it should be to harmonize, to have the same rules in all member states, which I can understand. But when it comes to social policy at the EU level, they're much against legislation. And that's actually something I can understand in a way, because it would be better, of course, if social partners at the EU level could agree through social dialogue, through collective agreements, how the labour market should look like, the working conditions and the wages. But unfortunately, EU social dialogue hasn't functioned really well in the past, I would say, 10, 20 years almost. It was Jacques Delors that launched it, same time as he launched the internal markets. We are mentioned in the treaties that there should be a social dialogue, but we haven't been able to agree much in the past years. And I think there is a need for renewal of social dialogue, and the employers should be very interested in this, but I don't see the interest right now, at least. But it would be in their interest, rather than legislation, it would be better for them to have a collective agreement instead.
And is that possible to exist at an EU level, given the extraordinary diversity of the actual circumstances, let us say as between Greece and Sweden, or between Ireland and Latvia? These are extraordinarily differentiated to do with economic dynamism, demographic trends, etc. And these elements, this mélange, this mixture in different places, is somewhat unique to the places. And so a standardization, as it were, could be conceptually desirable, but very difficult to embed given the differentiated circumstances on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, labor market policies, social policies is the area where you see those huge differences. And that's why in the treaties it says that different national labor market models needs to be respected. But I think we are in the process of converging and learning from each other. There is some EU legislation to give a minimum floor. There is this European Pillar of Social Rights. I think it goes very slow, but in the future we will have more similar labor market models, which would also make it easier for the EU level to have influence on those labor markets.
Let me finish with two themes, if I could, briefly. We've had a big debate, which is to do with economy and society, contextually important, about the relative weights of monetary policy and fiscal policy. And even the monetary authorities are telling us they've used their bazooka, they've applied their methods, and they're kind of running out of road. So if something is to pick something up, it should fall to fiscal policy. Talk to us a little bit about where you're located, the Trade Union Congress, in this space of fiscal policy activism versus fiscal policy prudence, and at the limit even schwarze Null, so to have a black line every year in the budget.
Well, our position is that, I mentioned it earlier, we think the Stability and Growth Pact needs to be revised. It was engineered in a time when there was perhaps need for, or member states were agreeing that there was a need for frugality and economic, strictness. These are not the times we need to give the member states some space to invest in social policies, in skills and so forth. But I think that's our main focus right now. I'm coming from a non-Euro country, so I'm not an expert on the Eurozone. But we are the ETUC is calling us also for a specific Eurozone budget in order to make the necessary investments, and also in order for non-Euro countries not to hinder the Eurozone to integrate further. And actually, I think also as a Swede, I think we are trading with the Eurozone countries lots, and we need the Eurozone to function properly. So if the Eurozone countries need to make reforms, then Sweden and others, Poland, shouldn't stop the Eurozone. So I'm now, and in a way, advocating for two-speed Europe. But I think when it comes to the Eurozone, there's still a lot of things to be done, because when the next crisis hits, we will be there again. Okay, some measures have been taken, but not enough. And I don't think we stand ready for the next crisis.
I agree. And one last point, if I could perhaps raise it with you, which is again of a general character. You said how much you look forward to this debate, this dialogue on the future of Europe. And it's clear that your preference is to see already some treaty changes. Now, these could, of course, extend well beyond, as in a dialogue, well beyond social policy and economic policy. We've had an increasing tendency in member states for electorates to want to have a say. And if I might use the somewhat populist and I find abusive language at times, not to let the elites impose things on them. So I have a question which contains in it the seeds of a fear, which is if we make a significant treaty change resulting in a response demanding referenda, that we may be creating the greatest stick for populists to beat us with in the context of the current political zeitgeist and the way it works.
Yeah, we had some bad experience. When in Ireland,
in France, in Netherlands, different stages.
I was
Sweden.
Yeah, Sweden.
I've been there, done that also.
And I guess European leaders are not that. They don't have the appetite to do that again. But I think we can't. In a way, we can't hide. We can't just stop evolving, stop discussing, stop integrating because there is a risk of populist forces taking over. I think this needs to be discussed, but I think that's why it's also a good idea of the Commission to start with a 2-year conference, to have a big debate, and then perhaps have treaty changes. Because we need to be careful, of course, what kind of changes there should be. We should be careful so the European integration doesn't, withdraw or regress. Sorry. I don't have a good answer, but I can only advocate open debates, and I think the Commission is on the right path here to have civic dialogues and including social partners, and not only EU institutions. I understand that the Commission is planning to have civic dialogues in all member states, and that's needed. It can't be a Brussels-led exercise. So this is, I'm optimistic. Let's see.
Per Hilmarsson, on behalf of the Jean Monnet Foundation, I really do appreciate the time you've taken with us today and the extent of your engagement. Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.